Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at a story of total collapse. You see, long before the first actual gunshots of World War II even echoed across Europe, the foundation for the deadliest conflict in human history was already, quietly, being laid.
Think back to 1918. A thoroughly exhausted Europe was celebrating what they desperately hoped was the end of all major conflicts. But, as we know, peace proved to be a tragic illusion. Okay, let's dive into this. How did a continent, one that was already reduced to absolute rubble, manage to catch fire again just 2 decades later? Well, the root causes were actually hiding in plain sight.
The interwar period wasn't exactly a time of healing and recovery. It was a massive catalyst. Just look at the cascading rhythm of these crises. We go from a punishing peace treaty instantly into economic hyperinflation and then boom, almost immediately into a global depression. This relentless compression of social and economic ruin became deeply, deeply fertile ground for extremism.
Take the 1919 Treaty of Versailles. In theory, it was designed to prevent Germany from ever becoming a military threat again. But instead of securing a lasting peace, these incredibly harsh conditions, forcing them to accept total blame and pay massive reparations, well, they just created deep, lasting humiliation. Across the nation, that resentment quietly morphed into a serious desire for retribution.
And by 1923, Germany's economy didn't just stumble, it completely vaporized. We're talking hyperinflation so severe that workers had to spend their wages instantly. Families were literally carrying baskets of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread. What's truly fascinating and terrifying is that it wasn't just cash being wiped out. The life savings and the stability of the entire middle class just vanished overnight.
Now, there was a brief economic recovery in the mid-20s, but it was a total illusion. Because when the American stock market collapsed in 1929, the Great Depression hit, and millions of Germans suddenly found themselves without work, without food, and without hope. It's a stark reminder of human nature, really. In times of absolute severe crisis, desperate populations will eagerly trade their hard-won liberties for anyone promising a simple way out.
And that profound desperation opened the door wide for the Nazi Party. After a failed violent revolution in 1923, Adolf Hitler completely pivoted his strategy. He weaponized the nation's trauma. He exploited democratic elections and used hateful conspiracy theories to scapegoat minorities. It's a chilling historical lesson in how institutions can literally be dismantled from the inside out.
But what's really striking to realize is that this authoritarian contagion wasn't just localized to Germany. The global landscape was shifting violently. Over in Italy, a fascist dictatorship was already demanding absolute loyalty to the state to restore imperial glory under Mussolini. Meanwhile, a highly militaristic Japan aggressively expanded into Manchuria and China, desperate to feed the resource hunger of its rapidly growing empire. So while all this global aggression surged, where was the newly created League of Nations? Totally powerless. Because they lacked any real military enforcement. Aggressive expansions were met with, well, mere protests. The trauma of the First World War made the world way too reluctant to act. It remains this timeless lesson on the extreme dangers of an international diplomacy operating without the actual mechanisms or the willingness to enforce its own rules. It really didn't take long for Hitler to realize the major world powers were entirely unwilling to confront him. Moving troops into the demilitarized Rhineland in 1936 and annexing Austria in 1938, these were calculated tests. He was probing the international boundaries, and every single time he found absolutely zero resistance. The ultimate test came when Germany demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Convinced that compromise could prevent another world war, British and French leaders actually agreed to the annexation, shockingly, without even consulting the Czechs. Returning from Munich, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain confidently and tragically declared they had secured peace for our time. That tragic optimism barely lasted a few months. Completely ignoring the Munich Agreement, Hitler just swooped in and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was the brutal wake-up call the West needed. They finally realized that endless concessions weren't actually buying peace. They were just subsidizing a rapidly expanding war machine. Then came a massive geopolitical shockwave. Just days before invading Poland, Germany and the Soviet Union, who were bitter, extreme ideological enemies, signed a non-aggression pact. But the secret reality of that agreement was far darker. It was a cold, ruthless political calculation to literally carve up Eastern Europe into spheres of influence,
allowing both dictatorships to expand without stepping on each other's toes. On September 1, 1939, that catastrophe was unleashed. The invasion of Poland introduced the world to Blitzkrieg, or lightning war. And it wasn't just a new tactic, it was a revolutionary shift in warfare. By perfectly coordinating aircraft, armored spearheads, artillery, and fast-moving infantry into a single, devastating blow, they generated a speed of destruction that absolutely stunned military observers. You have to remember, the military doctrine of the era was still completely anchored in the static trauma of the First World War. Leaders expected months of slow, bloody trench battles fought over yards of mud. Instead, Blitzkrieg pierced traditional defenses instantly. They bypassed strong points to cut off supply lines, creating immediate, paralyzing panic. The world was completely caught off guard. Yet, even after Britain and France declared war, the Western Front entered this surreal period of quiet, known as the Phony War. While Poland was ruthlessly crushed and partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union, the Allies launched no major offensives. They simply waited behind their defensive lines through a long, very uneasy winter. By April 1940, that eerie quiet was violently shattered. Hitler had no intention of keeping the war limited. Sweeping through Denmark in mere hours and conquering Norway, Germany strategically seized vital naval bases and secured their uninterrupted access to the Swedish iron ore shipments. They absolutely needed those to keep their war machine running. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer tactical audacity of the German command in May 1940. They executed the Ardennes Gamble. While launching a diversionary attack north, they sent their main armored force straight through the dense Ardennes forest, terrain Allied planners had stubbornly deemed impossible for tanks. In a flash, they crossed the Meuse River, trapping hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers right against the English Channel. 338,000. I want you to really think about that massive number for a second. Faced with total annihilation at Dunkirk, Britain orchestrated an absolute miracle. 338,000 Allied soldiers rescued in just over a week during Operation Dynamo. And they weren't just saved by naval destroyers. It was an improvised flotilla of civilian yachts, ferries, and fishing boats crossing the channel in shallow water under heavy fire to preserve the core of the British Army. The men were saved, yes, but the battle for the continent was decisively lost. France, a nation possessing one of Europe's largest armies, fell in just 6 weeks. It was a shocking defeat. By mid-June, an armistice split the country, and the global community watched in total disbelief as the Vichy regime took over. Britain now stood entirely alone against the Axis powers. To cross the Channel, Hitler absolutely needed air superiority, sparking the Battle of Britain. Germany relentlessly targeted airfields, radar stations, and factories to destroy the Royal Air Force. What saved Britain wasn't just the sheer endurance of exhausted ground crews working through the night, or young pilots flying multiple scrambles a day. It was the technological edge of advanced radar early warnings that kept intercepting the incoming bombers. Deeply frustrated, the German strategy shifted to a much darker phase, the Blitz. They relentlessly bombed British cities night after night, hoping to break the nation's spirit. Just picture families rushing into underground stations while London burns above them. But it created a fascinating psychological paradox. Instead of shattering civilian morale, these acts of courage actually galvanized the community, forging a legendary resilience that simply refused to despair. By the end of 1940, the crucial takeaway was undeniable. Air superiority had failed. The German war machine hit its first major wall, forcing Hitler to indefinitely postpone his invasion of Britain. This resilient defense handed the Axis powers their first real strategic defeat. But as you probably know, the conflict that began with tanks crossing into Poland was no longer confined to Europe. New brutal fronts were rapidly erupting across North Africa and Asia, eventually pulling in over 60 countries. The scope of the horror had completely transformed. So, with the globe now entirely engulfed in flames, what would it ultimately take to dismantle this unprecedented global war machine? Think on that as we continue to explore the realities of the Second World War.